All right. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming along. As Matt said, I'm here to talk to you about advanced partitioning through the XMLA endpoint. It is a really niche subject, but I have actually now implemented it in two of my customers, so perhaps it's going to come mainstream at some point. But before I go on, I'm going to give you a little introduction to myself. So I am the lead data and analytics consultant at Triangle Information Management, which is an awful lot of words to say. But what I do is I like to work with Power BI from implementations, migrations, helping people optimize things, showing people best practice, teaching people things. I work with lots of clients to do all of those things above. As you can hear from my accent, I am born and bred in Bristol. I've been working in data for about 8 years. I started off in the recruitment industry where we did lots of really bad practice things like running SQL queries off of a live database. We actually had one particular query that we used to have to tell everybody it was an IT maintenance because it ran for so long it kicked everyone out of the database. After getting the data, we used to throw it into Excel and create dashboards in there. I then moved into the facilities management industry, which is where I really started to learn like the best practice of visualization and things like that. Started to work with Tableau first, and then we moved into Power BI when it really started to pick up pace. After a couple of years working with Power BI and facilities management, I moved into consultancy where I've been for the last 2 years. That makes up my 6 years of working with Power BI in total. I've listed basically all the things you can be specialist in Power BI. That's mainly because I see myself as like a jack of all trades, master of none. I'm not especially great at Power Query, but I can find my way around it and guide most people through most problems. When I say I'm not especially great, I mean there are some ridiculous things people do on LinkedIn, solving challenges that I just look at and start to cry a little bit. If you want to find me after this, there is my LinkedIn handle. I do spend a fair bit of time on there trying to demonstrate best practice, trying to guide people through data problems, talking about challenges. And also each week I share basically all of the things I read every week that interest me. So yeah, if you want to hook up with me on LinkedIn, find me at that LinkedIn handle. What am I going to be talking about today? So first things first, I'm going to set the scene for partitioning, just so that everybody in the room kind of understands what partitioning is. Then I'm going to talk about incremental refresh, which is Power BI's out-of-the-box solution for partitioning. Then, in order to set the scene for the rest of the demonstration, I'm going to talk about the XMLA endpoint. So that again, once everybody knows what that is, we can then talk about the more complex partitioning solutions, which, although supported by Microsoft, are actually out of the box. So you have to leverage the XMLA endpoint in order to do it, which is why we're going to introduce it. I will not be talking about direct lakes, lake houses, fabric notebooks, or any other fabric functionality that might replicate exactly what I can do. I am not an expert in fabric. I don't think I ever will be, given that I'm actually, despite what I'm going to show you today, more of a visual person. This is just a speciality that I have because I've had to grow it for several clients. So yeah, I won't be talking about or taking any questions on fabric functionality, unfortunately. If you've got those, keep them for Chris Webb in a couple of weeks, because he'll definitely be able to give you them. So what is partitioning? So partitioning is the breaking up of a table into smaller or more manageable chunks or parts. You would normally, and especially if you're doing this at a database level, you would normally partition tables by date. It's the most common thing. It makes an awful lot of sense. But if you're not going to do it by date, that's why I've underlined normally, because through Power BI and the example I'll show you later, you will actually be able to partition by something that's other than a date. And partitioning is very useful when you work with like a large semantic model, and especially where historic data doesn't change. I say often there will be ways you can basically refresh historical data, and I'll show you that and walk you through that later as well. But if your historical data doesn't change, then you are ripe for partitioning straight away. Just to give you a practical example of what this might be, so you might load up to Power BI or any other database a table for January to May, and it might have 35 million rows in it. If you were going to partition that table, you might choose a policy, which is what you would do in Power BI, that would separate those out into monthly partitions for January, February, April, and March. If we rewind back and imagine that we are actually in May, because you might set your most recent data to refresh at a daily level, you would end up with daily partitions all the way through May until you get to the end of May, when Power BI is going to roll them all up. And I'll talk about that a little bit in a second. But that's partitioning in a nutshell. It's just separating a table into smaller bits. So why would you partition in Power BI? Well, first things first, it's going to save you hosting all of your data in a PBIX file. So imagine you've got a fact table that's got 10 million rows in it, billions of rows, etc., etc. Last thing you want to do is move all of that data into your desktop file and host that on your laptop. So it's going to save you doing that. I'll talk you through how and why it does that in a minute. Next up, it's going to improve query and report performance. I say it's going to, it might do. There are situations where it won't, and I will talk about those towards the end. Situations where it will improve report and query performance are because when you partition a table up into smaller chunks, Power BI will store some metadata about each partition. And when you run a DAX query into the Vertipack engine, that will happen was it will read the metadata and it will only scan the partitions it needs to, rather than scanning that whole table. So if your partitioning is done correctly, and if you do it through Power BI automatically, you definitely will. If you do it my way, you're definitely going to have to do some testing. Talk about that afterwards. If you do it properly, Power BI will make sure that your partitions are of the right size to make sure that basically everything's going to be improved. After the improvement of report and query performance, you're going to speed up your refresh, and this will definitely happen. And the reason that's going to happen is because when you partition a table, you're only going to refresh the most recent partitions and the ones you set up in your policy. So all of that data that basically doesn't change very much, that's not being refreshed anymore. So your refresh instantly becomes a huge amount quicker. What that does is that reduces the resources that are required for a refresh, which essentially means that on your premium capacity, you'll be using much less resource. You will reduce the memory usage because of the reduced resources. Basically means there'll be more memory available for DAX queries. And all of that, those two together are going to reduce the load on the capacities. All of those things above are going to mean that you've got a much more optimal and Power BI environment, which will keep our IT overlords happy. And this is obviously a CTIO sat in the server room being very happy at the fact that his Power BI environment is nicely running. And of course, if we don't have to keep going back to our CFOs to ask them every 5 minutes for a new premium capacity, they're going to be happy with the reduced cost of the organization. So yeah, there's one sat in the safe. Next up, I've been talking for quite a lot, so I have already given you the answer to this, but if somebody can tell me how you partition in Power BI out of the box. 5 points, excellent, thank you very much. So incremental refresh is the way you would do this automatically. What Power BI will do is it will automatically create the partitions on the Power BI service when you publish up to the service and hit refresh. That first refresh, Power BI is going to scan, look at the policy, create the partitions, and then load the data into them. From that moment onwards, data is archived. That is the Power BI word. I put stored in brackets because I think stored makes much more sense. Archive to me means it's put on a shelf, forgotten about, never used again. Stored just means it's there if you need it. Interchangeable terms, I prefer stored. Power BI will give you archived. Data is archived or stored or refreshed, and it's obviously separated into partitions where they're stored or where they're refreshed, and we'll have a look at that in a second. And as I mentioned earlier, when you do this through Power BI out of the box, all of your partitions are automatically managed. So as I said earlier, when you have daily partitions and you now have a complete month, it'll roll them all up into 1 month partition instead of having lots of many day partitions. Overall, so a practical example of this again, we're going back to the example from January to May. You have to imagine it's the 10th of May here. So it's currently running a refresh on the 10th of May, which means that all of those partitions are not going to be refreshed if you set your thing to only refresh the most recent days, 3 days worth of data, for instance. And that's going to be the example that I play out through most of this when we look at incremental refresh in my PBIX files. If you obviously tell it to refresh the last 3 days worth of data, those are going to be refreshed. And as we move through the year, those brackets will change as well, obviously. Anyone got any questions so far on what partitioning is, how it works in Power BI before I go into the demo? Cool, no demo. Sorry, no questions. There is going to be a demo still. For anyone wondering what that logo is, that is the Blue Peter logo. It was a TV show on children's television in the UK. They had lots of craft demonstrations. Most of my demonstrations now are basically aligned to what they used to say about their craft demonstrations, which is, here's one I made earlier. And actually, it just reminds me to go into my demos. So, When you want to set up incremental refresh in Power BI, you need three things to start with. You need to make sure you've got range start and range end parameters. You need to have a date time column, and you need to make sure query folding is in place. You will have to make sure all of those are there before you set your refresh policy. And now I have to sort of awkwardly bend down a little sec, but we should be fine. So I have an incremental refresh policy set on this table. So the first thing you notice is I have these refresh, bear with me, and now my mouse disappeared. There we go. So I have range start and range end parameters. First thing to notice here is that I haven't put a space in between the words. If you do that, it will not work. You have to do it exactly as you see here. Second thing to notice is I've set this up so it only contains a day's worth of data. That is because all I need in this file is enough data to check the data types, understand the structure of the table, perhaps write any DAX calculations that need to run over that fact table, and that's all I need. So if you need 2 or 3 months worth of data in order to check some date time calculations, stick that in there. I myself just need 1 day's worth of data in this model, so that is all I've done. As I said, that's not what's going to happen up on the Power BI service. When you publish this to the Power BI service, the first refresh will load all of the data that is in that table in. Next thing to notice, this model here didn't actually have a date time column. So you see here, as soon as I move up the Power Query steps, we start to see all of the data that's unfiltered. So this doesn't have a date time column at all whatsoever. All I have done is I have duplicated one of the date columns. In this case, it is the return date. I have named it incremental date, and then I've just changed the type so it is date time. So when I say you need a date time column, it doesn't actually have to have times in it. It will work as long as it's structured as a date time column, it will work. The last thing you will need to do is obviously apply a filter to the rows, and that's the last step. Now there is something to note up here as well, so hopefully I get this right this time. Cool, there we go, much better. So you will notice that I have applied the filter to the incremental date column that I connected, but also what I've done is I've made sure there is only an equals on one side. If you put an equals on both sides, if you write this naturally, what you will find is that you will end up with data duplicated into your partitions, because there will be a day that is the same on each partition, and it'll be your final day. So you need to make sure when you do this, if you're typing it yourself, only put that equals on one side. Doesn't matter which, but make sure it's there. Those 3 things, so 2 things actually, the range start and range end parameters and the date time column with the filter, enable me to do the final thing, which is make sure that I've got query folding in place. Now, query folding is a word that I can't say well, but query folding is Power BI's ability to send a query back to the database in the exact format that it needs the data. So what this is to say is that incremental refresh basically only really works on SQL databases. Things that Snowflake, it can be used as well, but anything that has underlying SQL, you can use incremental refresh. If you can't, unfortunately, you won't be able to use it. And it basically, query folding is active if Power BI is able to send a query back to the database, it runs on the database, and then the data is sent back to Power BI exactly as it needs. This is another thing that helps speed up your refresh, because there's no processing done at all whatsoever on the Power BI side. All the data is just received exactly as it's needed. You can check whether query folding is in place by right-clicking on one of your steps. So down here, we can see that it's active because I can click this button and I will be able to see the query. If that view native query thing looked more like move after, then you've broken query folding and incremental refresh will not work. If you do happen to break query folding, you basically need to go back through your steps and find the first step where query folding is inactive, and that means the previous step has broken it. You will need to fix that. On Microsoft documentation, there will be lots of things that you can do with query folding in place, such as duplicating columns. You can change most data types, but you can't change a decimal into an integer. There's about 300 different types of integer in a SQL database, and Power BI just doesn't know which one you're going to want, so it breaks it. Any sort of advanced transformations beyond that, not necessarily going to work. You can definitely merge and append tables, things like that, as long as it's all from the same database. So there's quite a lot you can do that will not break query folding. I won't be talking about all of the things and all of the things you can't through this. If you do ever want to see the SQL query that Power BI submits, I advise you to not do it because Power BI is not very good at writing SQL. But basically, you can have a look through and see exactly what Power BI has done to your applied query steps to make sure that query folding is in place. Everything good with that before I move on? Lots of nodding. Excellent. So once that is in place, you will then be able to set your policy on your table. I have it set on 2 tables in here, but I'm just going to use the return tables as an example. So once you've got that in place, if you right click on your table, select incremental refresh, you can set your policy. This particular policy is archiving or storing, as I said earlier, data starting 5 years before the refresh date, and then it's going to incrementally refresh data from 3 days previous to the refresh date, which is the example that I showed you earlier. Once all that is good, you can obviously publish up, hit refresh, and this is that exact model there. You'll see the first refresh has happened, and instead of that 1 day's worth of data in March 2024, we have data going back to 2020, which is the whole table for both sides. So that is incremental refresh in a nutshell. There is actually just one more thing to talk you through. So in this particular model, slightly different model, I have a different policy set on order and returns. So order has the exact same policy that we saw earlier. No, actually, order doesn't have the returns table has exactly the same thing. This one, as you can see, I've started to archive my data 4 months before the refresh date, and then I have the same daily policy. What that does is, because Power BI is not actually going to keep any data previous to the refresh, that 4 months, instead of this orders by year looking like a full 5 years worth of data, in this particular model that's been refreshed, you'll notice, and I haven't refreshed it since April, which is why it's only got up to April, but you can see the orders has data for this year, only the last 4 months, and then returns has data for the full 5 years. So you can basically use incremental refresh to filter out any data from your table that you do not want to report on at all whatsoever. All make sense? Wicked. Okay. Cool. Let me just close some of these windows down, otherwise we won't have the easiest of presentations in a second. Okay. So the next part of the talk, we are going to basically frame it around these 2 questions. So what happens if your first refresh exceeds the maximum time allowed, and what happens if you need to update the model without overwriting the data? In both of those situations, you're going to need to use the XMLA endpoint. And as I said, I'm going to talk you through what that is now, just so that we're all on the same page. So the XMLA endpoint is a connection interface. It's been available since 2019 in preview, and then went into general availability in 2021, which is a lot quicker than things go into general availability nowadays in Power BI. It allows tools to access, manage, and interact with semantic models that are held up in the Power BI service, and it does this by exposing the analysis services engine that sits behind every model. It supports both read and write operations. By read, I mean that those programs down there, plus quite a few more, can actually submit queries to a Power BI semantic model, and it will return data into them to visualize. If you're in certain programs, Tableau is actually one of them. You can return data into a Tableau data set and visualize it from Power BI. And by write operations, I mean that basically you're opening up like a whole Pandora's box of modeling opportunities, most of which I'm going to talk you through now. So you can basically, by engaging the XML endpoint, start to do comprehensive data set management through tools like DAX Studio, Tableau Editor, SQL Server Management Studio. We'll have a little bit of a look about what those things look like when we start to talk about advanced partitioning. You can do application lifecycle management through ALM Toolkit, and we're definitely going to see that in a second because it solves one of our questions. You can then start to look at complex modeling through Tableau Editor. Now, I don't know how many people are familiar with Tableau Editor. I'll show you a few things with it to do with it, but calculation groups which have just made it into Power BI, they've actually been surfaced and available in Tableau Editor since 2019. So all of this functionality that Tableau Editor has access to is actually supported and it's enabled in desktop. They just haven't had a chance to start building the things within desktop to enable it. Calculation groups, they finally got around to it, but yes, they have been available for a long time in Tabular Editor. You can also, if that is your thing, do things like debugging and monitoring through programs like DAX Studio, SQL Profiler. DAX Studio is great for debugging measure problems. If you've got a really slow running measure, you can start to analyze why things are taking a long time if you know how to read query plans. And if your refreshes are taking a long time or if they're failing, you can use the SQL Profiler to monitor or analyze and understand what's going on under the hood when your Power BI refresh is going. A couple more things on the XML endpoint. You need a premium capacity or premium per user in order to use it up on the server. Once you have enabled it, there are two different settings. They're both tenant level settings. They are found in slightly different places. So as you can read, the headlines are slightly different. But the message is the same. Make sure you use read and write when you enable it. Otherwise, you won't be able to use its full capabilities. And the last thing, once you have got a premium workspace, premium per user in this case, available, the way you basically connect any of these programs to the Power BI service is this little connection string that you see down at the bottom. You can copy that, paste it into various places when you start to connect. Go through authentication, whatever you need to do, and you'll be connected to your model. You'll probably see little bits of me doing that in a second as we move through the demo, I think. Bear with me. Okay, so we're just back to those questions, which I wanted to remind you of. So what happens if we exceed the max refresh time? And what happens if you need to update the model without writing the data? So first things first, the refresh time. Power BI Premium, for anyone who didn't know, has a refresh time limit of 5 hours. If your refresh goes beyond that, Power BI will kill it and it won't be able to refresh. So in order to get around that, you need the XMLA endpoint because that time limit does not apply through the XMLA endpoint. In order to get this done, you've got several options. You can either bootstrap the partitions in Power BI Tabular Editor. I'm going to show you that in a second. Or you can go straight to SQL Server Management Studio and you can selectively process tables, partitions, or you can just run a process of the whole model. And I'm going to show you what both of those look like as well. So first things first, Tabular Editor. I have connected to my model. And as we can see, if I expand the tables down here, don't import a new table. These are all the tables that are in that model I showed you earlier that was held down in my desktop file. If I look at the returns table where I have a policy set, because there is a policy on it, I can apply the refresh policy. I'm not going to do that just yet because as you see at the moment, there is just that one partition that I had built in there earlier. As soon as I hit returns and apply the refresh policy, it's going to look at the policy that's in that model. And then it's going to create the partitions that it needs. So do you remember I told it to refresh data, store data 5 years in previous, which is why it goes back to 2019. And then we have the most recent quarters rolling up to a full month in there as well. Obviously, what this has not done is this has not put any data in them at all whatsoever. Tabular Editor 2 doesn't allow you to process refreshes. I think Tabular Editor 3, if you're fortunate enough to have a license, does. So once you've bootstrapped your partitions, you're still going to have to head over to SQL Server Management Studio. And this is the one thing I forgot to sign into. So bear with me. Anybody who is eagle-eyed will notice I'm actually signed into our database. Go through MFA, sorry. Where's my MFA gone? There. I knew there'd be one. Apologies for this, everyone. Put it down before it scanned my face. Okay, so back on. So this particular model here, if I was to go to the orders table where I did not do the bootstrapping, we just look at the partitions, you'll see that we just have that one partition that would have been created because I haven't already told the model to create them. I'm going to process the table. Okay. So by right-clicking on the table, selecting partitions, you'll now see that all of those partitions that I just bootstrapped in Tabular Editor, they're there. They haven't got any data loaded into them. So when I say I can, from this program, I can process the whole table, I can process the whole model, or I can selectively process partitions, you will notice, if I'm actually with a partition selected, I can select as many of these as I want, or I can select the whole lot. So this is basically going to allow me to selectively process these partitions. If I want to only do this amount, once I've got the partitions that I want selected, I can hit the process button. We get a new pop-up. We will have to choose our process type. Now, for people who just use the server, they won't necessarily be aware of what the different types of Power BI refresh are. I would always advise people select full, because it's the only thing that basically drops all of the data in your table, loads everything in, refreshes all the relationships, any calculated columns that you've got in there, or any like linked calculated tables. That is the only thing, a full refresh, that will make sure all of the things in that table are done. There are various others you can do. Clear and add are fairly self-explanatory. Default will do most of that, but it won't do relationships and things like that. So it's just always be careful to do full. John will.
Yeah, will that be will that processing the partitions be sequential or in parallel?
It is parallel. Because it's in Power Query. So anything that happens in Power Query is refreshed in parallel. And actually that feeds into a point that I'll make really later when I actually start to talk about advanced partitioning, the subject. So I'll go back to that. So yeah, you can select as many of these as you want. Once you hit go, it will start to refresh. What you can also do is you can script that out. And you can start to add tables into it as well. So if you wanted to add in a few extra tables to your refresh, you can basically add some tables into this part of the refresh, or what you can do with this model is you can actually just do the full process. So it's not actually as obvious here, but process database, and you just select the same process type, full. And that's how you get around your 5-hour refresh. So if your refresh, the first time it runs, fails because it's exceeded the max time limit, you actually only ever really need to do this bit. But sometimes there might be use cases where you want to load slightly different partitions at slightly different times. By the way, if you want to know how to establish if your model is going to exceed that 5-hour limit, I think it's guesswork. You can probably do it on the size of your model. So I have a customer where we've got 3 fact tables over 5 billion rows. We knew that one wasn't going to refresh straight away, so we made sure that we did this first. But yeah, if your model is a little bit smaller, it's just guesswork. Unfortunately, the only way you're going to know is when you log in 5 hours after you triggered it and it's been cancelled. So yeah, if you suspect, probably best to do it this way. Okay, so any questions on all of that before I move on? Cool. So moving quickly on, what happens if you need to update a model without overwriting the data? With incremental refresh, basically none of your data lives in your PBX file. Remember, I just had 1 day's worth of data in my PBX file. So if I was to hit publish, should I have changed the DAX measure, or should I have added a column to a table? If I hit publish, it's just going to remove all that data from the server and wait 3 or 4 or 5 hours to add it back in again. So in order to make sure that you don't do all that, you need to basically use the ALM toolkit, which I'm just going to briefly show you now. Essentially, it is just an interface for moving things through from a Power BI desktop file to the server. You'll notice over here, I have my connection string. This is because I've already entered it. I'm just going to narrow this down because all I've got basically in this model are a few measures where I've changed the name. They used to be called hash orders. They're now number of orders, which is why it's going to create and delete some new, create some new ones, delete the old ones. And I've got one measure that's dependent on all of those measures, which is why it's going to update that. You can basically use ALM Toolkit to be really selective about what you put through to the server. So for this particular one, I've got these changes. I've also got changes that need to be made to my fact tables. And the majority of those changes are the fact that up on the server, if you see in red, actually, let's make this a bit bigger for you. There you go. So you see down the red side, which is the server side, those are all the incremental refresh policy-based partitions, and over on the green side, none of those exist. So I'm not going to want to update through ALM Toolkit, so I'm going to want to skip those. There is potentially a situation where you might not want to skip an update on your fact table, and that could be if you've added a column, for instance. So that what I've just done there is not going to be applicable, and that's why we have some options that I should talk you through. So all of the options up at the top above this database deployment, they are selected and they remember what's going to happen. The main one to talk about here is this for table updates retain partitions. With that first one ticked and the second one ticked, if you are using incremental refresh, if you were to up that fact table, it's not actually going to remove any of the partitions. It's going to put through the additional column or whatever you've done to that table. It's not going to remove the data. It's going to save it, and it's going to add the data into that new column should you need it. With these unticked, obviously, it's going to remove all of those partitions. It's important for me to mention this here because if you're doing advanced partitioning, your partitions are not refresh policy based. So Power BI has not decided on a refresh policy. Therefore, that was why when you came in, you saw that one was unticked for me, because at the moment I've been doing lots of updates on a table that has non-refresh policy based partitions. So that singular tick box at the top just makes sure that I'm okay. Last thing for me to do whilst I'm on these options, you have the processing full, default, do not process, etc., as we spoke about earlier. But then there's this important tick box down here, and this is why I always do this last. Basically, this tick box, as you can see, says process only affected tables. It's never ticked by default, and if you tick it now, the next time you come into it, it won't be ticked again. I think the reason they've done this is because they want you to come in and check your options, because it's the most important tick box to make sure that you have ticked. If you leave it unticked, Power BI is just going to process, or LM Toolkit is going to process your whole model, whether you like it or not. Every single table, whether they've got a change to them or not. So before you hit the validate and update buttons that you see up at the top, always come in here and tick that box. Otherwise, as I said, every single table is going to be refreshed. I'm not going to hit OK, and I'm not going to go any further forward because all I need to do now, once I've set all my settings and made sure I've skipped the tables I need to skip, I'm going to hit validate selection. It's going to make sure there's not any errors. I'm then going to be able to click this update button, and those changes will be shoved up to the server. So if you need to basically update your Power BI model and you don't want to remove any data, ALM Toolkit is your way.
Still free, right?
Yes, yeah, still free software. But it's all good. So the last part of the presentation, we get into the real bit of it. And this is where I said we might want to partition by something other than date. The scenario is, what happens if you receive a different country's data every day and you only want to refresh that data each day? So this is actually a sort of a client-specific scenario have. They receive data on Monday from the UK, Tuesday US, Wednesday France, Thursday Brazil, Friday Germany. Their data is going all the way back to 1998, so there's an awful lot of it, and we do not want to be refreshing even a whole country's data every single day. We only want to refresh the data that has just arrived and come in. Obviously, we then have to make sure that we're refreshing certain amounts of data, certain amount of days, etc., etc. So you can see our filter is going to potentially be over a date and something that defines the country. In order to do this, we need to engage advanced partitioning. So in order to set up advanced partitioning, the first thing you're going to do is open up Power Query, and you're either going to use M code to do your table transformations, or you could use custom SQL. The one thing you need to make sure you do with custom SQL is you need to make sure that you do it in a way that's not going to break query folding. Obviously, Power Query you do as well, but Power Query will tell you if you've broken query folding. If you use custom SQL, it's a little bit more difficult to find out what's going to and what's not going to break it. When you do this, you obviously need to make sure that you create one partition and one partition only. And again, that can be as small as you possibly like. The process, there's a couple of ways I'm going to show you, but it's exactly the same. You're going to replicate that partition and change it as many times as you need to for as many partitions as you have once the model is published up to the server. You're going to do that through Tabular Editor using TMSL, which is Tabular Modeling Scripting Language. Microsoft have some lovely alphabet soup abbreviations, and that is one of my favorites, especially as they just introduced TIMDL, which is Tabular Modeling Definition Language. There you go. You can also do it through PowerShell. I can't write PowerShell code though, so I'm not going to show you an example of that today. As I said, I'm going to show you Tabular Model Editor, and then I'm going to show you TSML. So first of all, we're just going to look at what the Power BI setup looks like. So this is basically exactly the same model. I've just changed it ever so slightly. So going through to Power Query, the first thing you will notice is there are no range start and range end parameters anymore. Don't need them because I have done all my transformations directly on the table. And you will see if I expand this row, give you a bit of a zoom in. There we go. So the final filter basically is set to have, this example has 1 year's worth of data. This is obviously using test data, so it's not my client's example. But I have filtered return date to only have data between the 1st of January 2021 and the 1st of January 2022. And then you can see I've applied a country key filter of 42. So that enables me to basically just have 1 year's worth of data for one country in there. And that is basically all you need to do in Power Query, because that creates that one partition that I'm going to then publish up to the server. Once you've published it up to the server, I'm just going to quickly show you in Tabular Editor how you would potentially do this if you had a very small amount of partitions to create up on the server. So bear with me. So once this is published, again, I can go into my table and I can actually see that this table has one that I've named rather nicely already. In order to do this without using Tabular Modeling Scripting Language and SQL Server Management Studio, like I said, if you've got a very small amount of partitions, say a max of about 10, you can right click on your partition, you can duplicate it, you can then rename it, which is very key because you can't have two partitions named the same, and obviously it needs to make a bit more sense. So say I wanted to do the same year for country 43, all I would need to do is now change the M code over to 43 down here, save it, and then that partition is now named and is completely different to this one because it's separated by a country code. So obviously I could go and repeat this process for all of the country codes that I have and all of the years if I wanted to. That's actually going to be quite long for quite a big model with lots of partitions. So that is why we, instead of doing this, because as I said earlier, this doesn't also load any data in. You're still going to have to load the data into them. That is why what we would actually do, if we've got a big model, is we'll start to do it programmatically. So first things first, programmatically, what you're going to do is you're going to, in SQL Server Management Studio, you're going to do exactly the same as I did before and go to the partitions view. This won't have that partition that I just created because I didn't save it. When you bootstrap partitions, it automatically saves that change. If you do what I did, you won't actually receive the benefit. You have to save it through Tabular Editor. So that's why you only see the one here. Up at the top, as I showed you, we clicked the script button earlier. So we're just going to actually do this on the partition this time rather than the refresh script that it had generated. And then I'm going to zoom in for you so you can actually see this. Cool. So what we see here, I will move around a little bit first of all. So this is actually the false code that defines what that partition is. This is exactly what Power BI has in its data analysis services database underneath. You can see here the script is called create or replace. That's because it's multifunctional, so you can either use it to create partitions or replace one that's existing. In this case, because we have a partition name here and a partition name here that are exactly the same, it's going to create that new partition. If this one was named as something that's already in the model and this one was named ever so slightly differently, that's going to be a replacement. So if this one was 3, and I'd obviously change the inputs down there. So that's the basic structure of a create or replace. You obviously got some database, which is the name of the Power BI model. You've got the table that it lives in. And then what we've got below is the actual script that defines the partition. So as you will see, we have, if we zoom down, the country code 43 here and the date inputs. So I'm obviously not going to, if I want to create many of these partitions at the same time, not going to do this up on here, which is why I can take this Power BI script, because I'm a rather basic human being sometimes, load it up into Excel and deconstruct it. So what I've got is I've separated out into the parts where I need to input something. So the first one here, you'll see ends where I need to name the partition for the first time. The second part of the script ends or picks up from there and then ends where I need to name the partition a second time. The third part of the script then picks up from there and then ends where I need to enter that first date. So what it's going to do is going to enter at the year point, because that's going to be the bit that changes. The next one obviously picks up from there and ends at the next date input. That final one basically then picks up from there and ends where I need to enter the country key. So as you can see, I've separated it out. I've then got one final bit, which is the closing wrapper. You can see also I've got bits for the refresh script and a final wrapper, because if I'm going to create all the partitions at the same time using a script, I'm also going to throw in at the end of that script another script that refreshes them all. So all I have to do is hit go. 5 hours, 6 hours, 10 hours later, it was actually 13 when we did the other model. It will have all of your data in there loaded up. So what I then do, once I've broken the scripts up into their independent parts, I come through to this, and I'm sure we've all, or most of us have done this with a SQL query at some stage. A, B, C, and D columns, I have obviously written a bit of a query over my database to understand how many years and how many countries have data. I've obviously done the start and the end to input that data. Column D just concatenates it so that I get that column, the partition name. I've then obviously written a bit of Excel code to join all of that together, referencing over the script parts. And the bit that you won't have seen so far is this cell up at the top, E1. So this has the very start of the script that I need to run. Now, when I generated that script earlier in SQL Server Management Studio, it didn't have this sequence bit because we only had one partition that we were going to create or replace. The sequence allows me to tie all of these together, as well as adding in the refresh script at the end of it. It's going to do all of those in sequence. And going back to John's question earlier about things happening in parallel, when you use the sequence command, you can actually put in max parallelism, which allows Power BI or overrides Power BI default for the amount of queries it's going to send back to your database at once. It can go up to 30, or it can go as low as 1. Power BI's default is 4. So if you hit refresh on the Power BI service, it will send 4 queries at a time back to your database. If you do it like that, it's going to send 30 queries at a time. I'd only advise you doing it at 30 if you've got a database that can handle that. So when, for instance, we did our 13-hour refresh, we did not have that set to 30 because we would have killed the database trying to refresh the volume of data, et cetera, that we did. So we actually set that down a little bit. Basically, yeah, as I said, you can actually go lower if you want to. Only if you've got a very sort of minimal database, you can actually go lower than Power BI's default volume value of 4 down to 1 as well. So obviously then what I will do is I'll copy all of this. This is going to be my complete script, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to paste it into here. Actually, that's going to be the slow way, and it's not going to work. And it's not going to work because I've used Excel, and Excel has a habit of putting in double quotes when it interprets something as an integer. So you'll see all of these things here have double quotes, and that is not going to work. If we compare it to what we saw, I actually did remove the other script, but if we compare it to what we see over here, obviously single quotes. So that's not going to work. Little tip for you, and I discovered this by accident, but if you paste it into Word, oh, he's gone on too far again. There we go. If you paste it into Word, this is probably going to be the wrong one. No, there you go. So I have my single quotes this time. So that is my refresh script done. Sorry, my create script. As I said, I'm going to programmatically do it so that it refreshes at the same time. So over here we have exactly the same setup, same data that I put into the last one. This has the starting point for the refresh script, and you can see rather simply this is just refresh. You can see I've specified my refresh type as full, and then it has all the objects defined below it. You'll see that final cell has my final wrapper, little bit of logic just to make sure that when the last cell is blank, it puts that in. So all I'm going to do is copy that, paste it below my script in Word, copy it, paste it back to SQL Server Management Studio. And there is a complete script that I can run, and it's going to load, I think there's about 20 or 30 different partitions up into my model and make sure that all the data is there. And that is how you set up incremental refresh, advanced partitioning in a nutshell. Yeah, I'm not going to hit go because this will take quite a while. Yeah, I can basically, I wonder if I've got a table actually that shows you. Unfortunately, I think this is going to be empty, but trust me, that works. Oh no, there you go. So this particular table I've already loaded up and run the script on, and you can see these rows are not particularly huge. It's not a huge database, but this was done exactly using that methodology here because you can see I've got all the names, etc., etc. So there's proof that it works. That is essentially all I can talk about, apart from some considerations. So once you use advanced partitioning or incremental refresh, you will not be able to download your PBX model from the server purely because it holds all of your data in it. So A, you don't want to, and B, there's just some various policies that once you've done a write operation, it won't work. So it's a consideration that if you use any of these things, make sure you keep your Power BI desktop file stored in a very secure location because you can't get it from the server anymore. The next consideration is, as I mentioned earlier, there is a possibility you could negatively impact query performance by having too many small partitions, which lead to too many small segments. Segments are tiny little things that live inside partitions. You can obviously control the size of your partitions through the policy that you set or through the M code that you give it, or the filtering. You can't really decide the size of the segments unless you start playing around with some really advanced settings that I've had to go through. There are some set values, so it's not that you could just put any segment size in. There are some exact sizes that you need to have. They go in increments of about 8 or 9 million bits of data. If you have too many small segments and too many small partitions, what's going to happen is Power BI is going to take far too long scanning all of those segments that live within partitions and aggregating all of the data back up. It's going to just take too long. So sometimes you can over partition and over segment a table. And you have to, if you're going to do this, you have to test for it. So basically I was spending months or weeks changing a segment size, loading some data up, testing things with DAX queries, binning all the data, changing the segment size, reloading it, running some DAX queries and assessing which one was the best for refreshing and for DAX queries. It takes a long time, basically. If you're going to do this, you also need to get familiar with TMSL. As you've seen, I've been showing you a fair few of the scripts, but there's other things you can do, such as deletes, merges, etc., etc., etc. And one of the reasons you're going to need to get familiar with TMSL is if you set all this up, advanced partitioning, you will not be able to take advantage of Power BI's automatic organization of your partitions. So you're going to have to do it. If you want to add a new partition in, you're going to need to work out a way to do that. Obviously, TSML is your first friend, but then you need to work out a way that uses the Power BI Advanced API, PowerShell, and a few other things. Our solution for this is quite complex and wasn't written by me because there's many of the programs that I can't actually work with. So yeah, it's a thing to think about if you're going to go through all of this. Remember, you've got to try and organize your partitions and refresh them at the end. That is all from me. So thank you very much for your attention. If I have any time for any questions, Flavio is nodding. I'll take the floor. That's pretty quiet.
Hey, so you mentioned all the data will basically basically be stored in the Power BI service.
Mhm.
So do you have to pay for those costs, or does your license of Power BI just cover that?
So if you are, if you use a premium capacity, there is scales of cost depending on the size of the capacity that you need. In order to do all of this, though, you do not need to have a premium capacity. You just need to have a premium per user license. But once you set up a workspace that is a premium per user workspace, anybody that needs access to that workspace, whether it's just to view a report or just to mend something, change something, build something, has to have a premium per user license as well. Those start at like £15.60, I think they are at the moment. So they're not hugely expensive, and they do give you access to all the premium features as well. You don't get the same storage limit that you do with a capacity, though. So once you start to get a certain number of users and certain sizes of data, it makes sense to go over to a capacity. All good?
Thanks.
There was one other question from over here. Unfortunately, for every table that you want to set it on, you have to set it on each table. Because, for example, like I showed you, you could have different policies set across different tables. So there's not a way of universally applying it to all your tables in your model.
My other dumb question.
Oh, here's another one. Do you know what? I had this answer a couple of months ago and I've now forgotten it. It is ridiculous, though.
Extended markup language.
It's just the XML end of the end.
What's the alias?
Oh, it's just like XML analysis.
Yes, XML.
Okay, yeah, it's called mark.
Honestly, I think it is the most ridiculous of Power BI and Microsoft's alphabet soup ones, though, because it doesn't make any sense. Any other questions? Mm-hmm. Premium per user, not changed at all whatsoever. All Power BI premium capacity SKUs have been migrated or will be migrated to Fabric capacity SKUs. I believe there is a slight price difference, but nothing changes. So none of the workarounds I showed you here today were because of premium or premium per user. Once you've got a premium per user license, you get access to all the premium features, just not the same amount of storage. Do I feel like there's going to be any issues? I think most people have a problem with the price increase. Functionality wise, obviously you'll get more functionality, much more functionality. It's up to people whether they enable it or not. Personally, if I had to second guess Microsoft, I think there'll be so much kickback that they'll have to change this decision. They've already gone back on a few decisions that they've made previously where certain things weren't going to be available at certain licensing levels. They've gone back on those. I think if enough people complain, there is the potential that they'll go back on that one as well. But yeah, otherwise, if you've got a premium capacity, the only change you're going to see is the change in price. Once that's switched over to a Fabric capacity, all functionality still exactly as it is, basically.
All right, shall we leave it there?
Yep.
All right.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Mike, thank you very much.